August 17th, 1992. Waukegan, Illinois. While babysitting two children, 11-year-old Holly Staker is sexually assaulted and murdered inside their apartment. 2 months later, a suspect named Juan Rivera confesses to the crime. He is subsequently convicted and receives a life sentence. However, since no physical evidence linked Rivera to the murder, and the veracity of his confession is called into question, he would undergo 2 separate retrials before his conviction is vacated for good. DNA evidence would link Holly Staker's murder to the death of a man named Delwyn Foxworth, and it's possible that another innocent person is serving time in prison for this crime. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering a crime which was initially solved, but has technically become unsolved again in recent years. The 1992 murder of an 11-year-old girl named Holly Staker. And I need to warn you up front, this is the most infuriating case we have featured on this podcast. You might find it upsetting, and there's a very good chance you will be absolutely outraged once you hear this story. I don't often cover wrongful conviction stories on this podcast, but this is a particularly egregious one. Not only did an innocent man, Juan Rivera, spend 19 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, but in order to keep him there, the state pretty much had to smear the reputation of the victim. I guarantee you, your jaw is probably going to drop when you hear some of the tactics they used. That is pretty much the main reason I decided to cover this case, because while there's been a lot of coverage about the horrible injustice that Juan Rivera experienced, we still don't know who actually killed Holly Staker, and it's recently been discovered that this individual was involved in the murder of at least one other person. Not only that, but the person currently serving time in prison for that particular crime might not have actually done it. The whole situation is just a ridiculous mess. I previously featured this case in an article I wrote for listverse.com titled 10 Convictions Based on False Confessions, which was originally published in May of 2013. One of the biggest misconceptions out there is that an innocent person would never confess to a crime they did not commit. Unfortunately, that misconception seemed to hold a lot of weight in this case, which is why it took 2 decades to get an innocent man released from prison. But before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and shorter minisodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it and leave us a rating or review at any of these sites, and that will help our podcast get more exposure. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on our website. If there's anyone out there who feels like making a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll definitely give you a shout out on a future episode. We've actually got a few donors this week, including Miranda, Fred, and Kristen, who has signed up for recurring monthly donations, so sincere thanks to all of you. And we've also got a couple of very special announcements to make. For starters, I am excited to say that I will be appearing at CrimeCon. That's right, in case you haven't heard, there will be a convention this year for true crime fanatics, taking place at the JW Marriott Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana, from June 9th to the 11th. It will feature a lot of special guests and presentations, but most importantly, the convention will also have a podcast row, where you can meet the top true crime podcasters in the business, and I'm pleased to say The Trail Went Cold is going to be on it. I feel quite privileged to be sitting there alongside the very best of the best, such as Generation Y, Thinking Sideways, True Crime Garage, The Vanished, and so many others. If any of you fine listeners are going to be attending CrimeCon, feel free to visit Podcast Row and say hi to me, as I would love to meet you folks in person. However, if you're planning to attend, but you haven't bought passes yet, there's more good news. CrimeCon is offering a special 20% discount for the Trail Went Cold's listeners. All you have to do is visit their website, crimecon.com, and enter the promo code TTWC20 when purchasing your pass. That's TTWC20. Just visit crimecon.com for more details, and I really hope to see you there in June. And if that wasn't enough, we also had a very special event take place this past weekend. For the first time, one of the cases featured on The Trail Went Cold has been solved. Back in January, I covered the 2009 disappearance of a woman named Pamela Butler. Well, even though Pamela's body has still not been found, her former boyfriend, Jose Rodriguez Cruz, has just been charged with first-degree murder. There have been some pretty major revelations these past few days, which I won't get into right now, but when all the important details are released, I plan to record and release a short mini-sode containing all the updates about this case. Ever since I started this podcast, I've been hoping to witness at least one of these cases find a resolution. The Trail Went Cold sends out its deepest sympathies to Pamela Butler's family, and I hope they can give her a proper burial sometime soon. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unsolved murder of Holly Staker. Our story begins in 1992 in Waukegan, Illinois. Our victim is 11-year-old Holly Staker, who is going to spend the evening of August 17th babysitting the two children of one of her neighbors, Dawn Engelbrecht, Dawn's 5-year-old son Blake, and her 2-year-old daughter Taylor. Holly showed up at the family's 2-flat apartment house in the late afternoon, but a few hours later, after darkness fell, Blake Engelbrecht approached one of his neighbors. Blake claimed that he had been playing outside, but when he returned home, the front door was locked and no one would let him inside. The neighbor took Blake to the nearby tavern where Dawn worked and explained the situation. When Dawn attempted to phone Holly, there was no answer, so she contacted Holly's mother, who met her at the apartment. When they went inside, they found Taylor Engelbrecht, but there was no sign of Holly, and the back door appeared to have been kicked in. The police were notified, and shortly after they arrived, they went inside the children's bedroom and were horrified to discover Holly's partially clothed body lying on the floor. She had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and stabbed 27 times. A broken knife was found in a nearby yard and was suspected of being the murder weapon. The murder sent shockwaves throughout the community, and there was enormous pressure to solve the case. But for the next month or so, investigators had no luck finding a strong suspect. However, on September 29th, they received a tip from an inmate at the Lake County Jail who had recently spoken with a fellow inmate named Juan Rivera, a 19-year-old Puerto Rican immigrant who was currently incarcerated for stealing a car stereo. Apparently, Rivera had told him that on the night of Holly Staker's murder, he was at a party at a house located near the Engelbrecht's apartment and might have seen the person responsible. The police questioned Rivera, and he confirmed the story. Rivera described seeing a man come and go from the party on multiple occasions that night, and the last time he saw him, the man looked sweaty and out of breath and appeared to have a fresh scratch on him. Well, when investigators looked into this lead, they discovered that no party had actually taken place at this house on the evening of August 17th, so naturally they became suspicious. On October 27th, Rivera was brought in for questioning again, and over the course of the next 4 days, he would be relentlessly interrogated without the presence of an attorney. During this time period, he was given 2 polygraph tests, but the results were inconclusive. Rivera eventually admitted to lying about being at the party, but he denied harming Holly Staker. However, Rivera's last interrogation session would last for 26 straight hours. Finally, shortly after midnight on October 30th, Rivera finally broke down and confessed to Holly's murder. Well, Rivera was left alone in the interrogation room while the detectives left to prepare a statement for him to sign. It wasn't long before Rivera started banging his head against the wall repeatedly, before falling to the floor and curling up into a fetal position. He was transferred to a padded cell to be treated by the jail's medical personnel. During this time, a nurse would witness him pacing back and forth, banging his head on the padded wall, pulling out clumps of hair, and rambling incoherently. Rivera was put in shackles, and the nurse concluded that he was likely having a psychotic episode and had lost all touch with reality. In spite of this, the detectives brought a statement to Rivera within hours of his initial breakdown and had him sign it. However, when Rivera's statement was brought to the state's attorney's office, there was concern about the number of inconsistencies in it, as Rivera had provided a number of details which did not match the facts of the crime. So Rivera was interviewed, though by this point, he had not slept for nearly 24 hours. He was convinced to sign a rights waiver and change several of the details from his original statement. When the detectives were satisfied that the statement was accurate, Rivera signed it, and shortly thereafter, he was formally charged with the murder of Holly Staker. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell you that there were a lot of issues with Rivera's so-called confession. It's problematic enough that he was questioned and signed a statement after experiencing a psychotic episode like that. But Rivera also had a history of mental illness, depression, and prior suicide attempts. He had an IQ of 79 and functioned at a third-grade reading level, so even before his breakdown, Rivera was easily susceptible to police interrogation tactics, and you can only imagine his mindset after being questioned for 4 straight days. And this was one of those confessions where the correct details Rivera did provide were already public knowledge, and the police were more than happy to feed him details in order to fix some of the inaccuracies in his statement. Just as an example, Rivera had initially stated that Holly was wearing a nightgown when he killed her, even though she was found wearing black stretch pants and a multicolored shirt. When the detectives were helping Rivera revise his statement, they'd say things like, "She had a multicolored shirt on, right?" And lo and behold, Rivera would agree with them and change his story, and the inaccurate details in his confession would be fixed. Even so, there were still some inconsistencies in Rivera's final statement. He claimed the boy was inside the apartment when he committed the murder, even though Blake Engelbrecht was playing outside and did not return home until after the crime took place. And even though Holly had been strangled, Rivera never made one mention of strangling her during the entire course of his interrogations. The issues with the confession might have been overlooked if there was any other strong evidence linking him to the crime, but there wasn't. When Rivera was questioned, he willingly provided samples of his blood and his hair to investigators, but they did not match any of the physical evidence from the murder scene, and none of the fingerprints found in the apartment matched him either. The truly ironic thing is that Rivera got himself into trouble when police discovered he was lying about being at a party on the evening of August 17th. But technically, the revelation that he had lied should have helped clear him. You see, after he was charged with stealing the car stereo, Rivera received probation and had been sentenced to home confinement. One of the conditions was that he had to wear an electronic ankle monitor. In fact, the reason Rivera was in Lake County Jail by the time the police questioned him was because he had violated the terms of his home confinement, so obviously that ankle monitor worked. Electronic monitoring system records showed that Rivera was at his home all night on August 17th. So even though Rivera had lied about attending a party, there was concrete evidence that he wasn't anywhere near the murder scene. And not only that, but Rivera's parents helped provide him with an alibi and confirmed he was home the entire evening. Rivera's mother was visiting a relative in Puerto Rico and spoke to him on the phone from there, and phone records did confirm this call took place around the approximate time period Holly would have been murdered. However, Rivera had initially claimed that he unplugged his ankle monitor, so investigators figured this must have happened, or the ankle monitor just malfunctioned that night. But ankle monitors are specifically designed to be nearly impossible to remove without alerting anyone, so it seemed like quite a stretch to believe that Rivera could have taken it off, left his house to commit murder, and then returned home to put it back on without anyone noticing. Anyway, Before Rivera's trial was to take place, his defense team was surprised to learn that there might actually be physical evidence against him after all. Shortly after he was sent to Lake County Jail, Rivera had apparently traded a pair of his sneakers to an inmate in exchange for a TV set. Well, this inmate later turned the shoes over to the police, and they supposedly discovered there was blood on them which belonged to Holly Staker. That sounded like pretty damning evidence, but the defense conducted an investigation on these sneakers and made a surprising discovery. Yes, those shoes did belong to Rivera, but they were not purchased until after the crime took place, and a defense investigator actually got a record of this from the Walmart where Rivera's mother originally bought them from. In fact, this particular brand of sneakers was manufactured in Hong Kong and was not even available for sale in the United States yet. At the time Holly was missing, those shoes would have been sitting in a warehouse in California, awaiting delivery to regional distribution centers where they would subsequently be sold in stores. Rivera's attorneys announced that they were planning to call an importer to testify that these sneakers would not have been available for purchase at the time of the murder, when, lo and behold, the prosecution suddenly decided to withdraw the shoes from evidence. This should have set off a lot of alarm bells, but we'll get back to those shoes in a little while. Anyway, Rivera finally went on trial in November of 1993. Other than his confession, the only other evidence against Rivera was the testimony of two jailhouse informants who claimed they had overheard him make incriminating statements about the crime. But both these individuals had very checkered histories and did not come across as the most reliable witnesses. Nevertheless, Rivera was found guilty and received a life sentence. Well, Rivera's defense team appealed the conviction, and because the trial was filled with procedural errors, the Illinois Appellate Court decided to overturn the conviction, and Rivera went on trial for a second time in 1998. Once again, the prime evidence against Rivera was his confession, but this time, the prosecution provided a witness, Dawn Engelbrecht's daughter, Taylor, who was now 8 years old and was being babysat by Holly Staker when she was killed. Taylor testified that she was in the apartment and witnessed a male attacker murder Holly and drag her body into her bedroom. She then identified Rivera as the assailant. But the obvious problem here was that Taylor was only 2 years old when this crime took place, and it seemed questionable that she could have such a vivid recollection of an event she witnessed at a very young age. There's a good chance Taylor did witness the murder and see the killer, but could you really trust the memory of a child who was only 2 years old at the time? Well, at this particular trial, the jury took 4 days to deliberate, but in the end, they found Rivera guilty again, and he received another life sentence. However, his defense team would not stop fighting for him, and they eventually filed a motion to do DNA testing on a semen sample from the murder scene. The testing excluded Rivera as the source of the semen, so his conviction was vacated for the second time. So now that Rivera had DNA evidence favoring his innocence, you'd think this would be the end of his ordeal, and he'd finally become a free man again, right? Well, not quite. And here is where the truly upsetting portion of this story begins. Even though the DNA testing excluded Rivera, the state decided they were going to retry him, and he wound up going on trial for the third time in April of 2009. The prosecuting attorney on this case was Mike Mermel, and I'm mentioning his name because he deserves to be publicly shamed for what he pulled here. Mermel had some explanations for why Rivera was still guilty. He claimed the DNA evidence did not match Rivera because it might have been contaminated by lab technicians, which seemed pretty unlikely, but this came across as a perfectly logical explanation compared to what was presented next. In his original confession, Rivera stated that he wasn't sure if he ejaculated when he raped Holly Staker, so Mermel presented a possible scenario where Rivera sexually assaulted and murdered Holly without leaving any semen behind. So who was the source of this semen? Well, according to Mermel, Holly had consensual sex with another unknown man shortly before she was killed, and the semen sample which did not match Rivera must have belonged to him. Yes, seriously. Maybe I should take this moment to remind you that Holly Staker was 11 years old. So in order to explain away the DNA evidence and secure a conviction on Rivera, the prosecution tried to convince a jury that an 11-year-old murder victim was sexually active. An 11-year-old girl, I might add, who was no longer around to defend herself or deny all these unfounded allegations about her. Good God, I only wish I was making this up, but it gets even more disgraceful. So who was this unknown man that Holly supposedly had consensual sex with? There was no evidence that she was involved in a sexual relationship with anybody at that time, but Mermel's logic was, well, no one's going to come forward and admit to having sex with an 11-year-old girl. So the prosecution had to paint Holly as the type of person who would have sex at age 11. This strategy involved calling Holly's twin sister Heather to the stand to testify. Even though Heather claimed that her sister was not sexually active, Mermel made her recount an incident where she and Holly were both sexually abused by one of their brother's friends when they were both 8 years old. And he also made Heather share a story about how she and her sister had once shown each other how to masturbate. These stories had absolutely no relevance to the actual crime, but it was all part of the prosecution's strategy to make the jury buy their consensual sex theory. And once again, I'll reiterate that Holly was no longer around to defend herself. But the most disturbing thing about this whole fiasco is that the prosecution's strategy actually worked. The jury apparently felt that the exculpatory DNA evidence wasn't enough to provide reasonable doubt, so Rivera was found guilty for the third straight time. Once again, he was sentenced to life in prison, but once again, his defense team were not going to give up until they exonerated their client. They appealed Rivera's conviction, and their 105-page brief had a ton of logical arguments in their favor. Among other things, they claimed that all this so-called evidence about Holly Staker's sex life violated the Rape Shield statute. Generally, this statute would be invoked by the prosecution in rape trials in order to prevent the defense from introducing the victim's past sexual behavior into evidence. It was pretty rare to see the defense invoking this statute in order to prevent the prosecution from introducing a victim's past sexual behavior into evidence. Well, the Appellate Court of Illinois agreed with these arguments. They dismissed the prosecution's explanations for the exculpatory DNA evidence as absurd and cited the unreliability of Rivera's original confession. In December of 2011, Rivera's conviction was overturned for the third and, thankfully, final time. And to give you an idea of what a huge debacle this had become, the appellate court actually took the step of barring prosecutors from ever trying Rivera again, which is incredibly rare. So after enduring 3 trials and spending 19 years in prison for a crime he never committed, Juan Rivera was finally released and became a free man again. But if you think investigators and prosecutors couldn't have looked any worse over how this whole thing turned out, you'd be mistaken. Let's get back to those shoes that the prosecution was going to introduce into evidence at Rivera's first trial before they suddenly decided to withdraw them. Well, these shoes were still being held in evidence, so Rivera's defense team eventually filed a motion to have DNA testing done on the blood spots which were on them. Not surprisingly, some of the blood matched Holly Staker. However, there was also DNA evidence on the shoes that matched the semen sample found at the murder scene, which had excluded Juan Rivera as the perpetrator. Of course, as you'll recall, defense investigators had uncovered hard evidence that Rivera's shoes were not purchased until after the murder and would not have even been available for sale in the US at the time Holly was murdered. So obviously, no matter who was responsible, those sneakers could not have been worn by the perpetrator during the commission of this crime. This strongly suggested that someone had deliberately planted blood on Rivera's shoes, probably because the physical evidence against him was non-existent. And whoever was responsible inadvertently planted DNA from the real perpetrator there as well. If the defense had not proven that the shoes were not available in the US, they likely would have been used as evidence against Rivera at his first trial. And there would be yet another revelation about possible evidence tampering. Rivera's attorneys also learned that a wood-handled bread knife had been found under some bushes near the crime scene in 1994. It was turned over to the police, but since Rivera had already been convicted by this point, the knife was destroyed without his attorneys even being notified of its existence. Now, I previously mentioned that a broken straight-edge knife was found in a yard near the Engelbrecht's apartment. In his original statement, Rivera claimed that he broke the knife during the stabbing and discarded it when he left, so it was assumed this broken knife was the murder weapon. However, we all know how unreliable Rivera's confession was, and there was no forensic evidence to definitively prove that the broken knife was used in the killing. The defense team had consulted a forensic expert who believed that the wounds on Holly's body were more consistent with a serrated blade rather than a straight-edge blade, and the bread knife found in the bushes did have a serrated blade. There's a chance that bread knife could have been the actual murder weapon, but it's long gone now. So as you can imagine, Rivera filed a wrongful conviction lawsuit over his whole ordeal, and given the overwhelming amount of evidence in his favor, he was awarded a settlement of $20 million. At that point, that was the largest amount ever awarded for a wrongful conviction in the history of the United States, and I'd say he pretty much deserves every penny. However, the story still doesn't end there, as a surprise revelation complicated this case even further. Before Rivera's third trial, the DNA evidence from the murder scene was entered into a national database, but no match was found. But years later, after DNA testing was done on the blood evidence from the sneakers, a match was made to evidence from another crime. In January of 2000, 3 intruders broke into the home of a 39-year-old Chicago resident named Delwyn Foxworth. They proceeded to tie him up at gunpoint and demanded he hand over some money. When Foxworth refused to comply, they beat him with a 2x4, poured gasoline on him, and set him on fire before fleeing the scene. Foxworth managed to douse the flames on his body and survive the attack, but he had burns on over 80% of his body, and these injuries had such a devastating effect that he died 2.5 years later. Well, the big revelation here is that the DNA from Holly Staker's murder matched the DNA on some blood found on the 2x4, which was used to beat Delwyn Foxworth. Foxworth himself was excluded as being the source of this DNA, so the blood had to belong to one of his attackers. But another complication is that someone is currently serving time in prison for this crime. In 2003, a suspect named Marvin Tyrone Williford was charged with Foxworth's murder. Since Foxworth's girlfriend witnessed the attack, she identified Williford as one of the assailants, as Foxworth had apparently owed him a debt. Even though there was no physical evidence linking Williford to the crime, the eyewitness identification was enough to secure a conviction, and Williford received an 80-year sentence. So does this mean that Marvin Tyrone Williford was Holly Staker's murderer? Well, the DNA evidence does not match Williford, so he definitely did not kill Holly, and he maintains that he had nothing to do with the murder of Delwyn Foxworth either. Williford's attorneys have attempted to use this revelation about the DNA evidence to secure Williford a new trial, but thus far they've been unsuccessful. But regardless of Williford's guilt or innocence, there were at least 2 more people involved in Delwyn Foxworth's death who have never been charged, and the evidence now shows that one of them was Holly Staker's killer. And because Juan Rivera was serving time for his crime, this person was allowed to remain free and commit another murder. Unfortunately, he may still be out there somewhere right now, but no one knows his true identity. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, there's really no other way to say it. This situation is an absolute travesty and one of the worst miscarriages of justice I've ever seen. It's disgraceful enough that an innocent man had to spend 19 years in prison, but what really elevates this case above other wrongful conviction stories is that in order to keep him there, the state essentially had to smear an 11-year-old murder victim's reputation. But before I get off on a rant about that, I have to be fair and concede that I do not blame the police for zeroing in on Juan Rivera at the start. Even his biggest offenders will admit that Rivera was not a saint at that time. He had a criminal record and was already in jail when he first showed up on the investigators' radar. Rivera did cause some trouble for himself by lying about being at a party on the night of the murder and seeing a potential suspect. He never really provided an explanation for why he did this, but he did have well-documented mental issues. At the outset, at least, I think detectives legitimately believed Rivera might be the killer, and they had good reason to thoroughly investigate him. However, it eventually reached the point where tunnel vision set in. The police were under enormous pressure to solve this case, and once they had Rivera in their sights, they were determined to pin the crime on him even if the evidence suggested he didn't do it. Whenever a high-profile murder takes place, there are always going to be cranks who decide to falsely confess. A skilled, properly trained investigator is supposed to be able to weed these people out during questioning. If a suspect provides a story which clearly doesn't match the facts of the crime, then they should be ruled out. Well, that didn't happen here, because even though Rivera's confession was filled with inconsistencies and inaccuracies, the detectives just decided to keep feeding him details about the crime and convincing him to change his story until the final version of his confession was close enough to the truth to seem believable. But putting aside the confession, the evidence with the ankle monitor should have been enough to convince investigators that Rivera did not commit this crime. I don't think a mentally disabled guy with an IQ of 79 is going to free himself from his ankle monitor, leave his house for several hours, commit murder, and then return home to put his monitor back on without sending off any alerts. This is when the investigators clearly knew that they were railroading an innocent man, but they just didn't care. And unfortunately, what happens in many of these wrongful conviction cases is that once the defendant is charged with a crime, the authorities essentially pass the point of no return. They believe it would be career suicide to admit they made a mistake and charge the wrong person, so even if compelling evidence surfaces to suggest the defendant is innocent, they'll stay the course and often come up with ridiculous ways to twist the facts and protect their case. The authorities passed the point of no return once they realized that none of the physical evidence from the murder scene matched Rivera. Rather than concede that maybe this guy didn't actually do it, it appears that someone went to the trouble of planting the victim's blood on Rivera's sneakers, which is pretty horrifying. I'm sure that a lot of you have watched Making a Murderer, where there are all these allegations about the police planting blood and DNA evidence to frame Stephen Avery for murder. Well, it's still up for debate about whether the allegations in the Avery case are true, but I have little doubt that evidence was planted in an attempt to frame Juan Rivera. There is just no other explanation for how Holly Staker's blood could have wound up on his shoes, when there is concrete proof that they were not available for purchase in the US until after the murder took place. Anyway, cases like this should also serve as a tool for educating the public about false confessions. There are probably still people who believe that no one would ever confess to a crime they didn't commit, but you'll find countless wrongful conviction cases where the accused did confess, but was later proven to be innocent. I guess it's not surprising that it happened here, given that Waukegan is in close proximity to Chicago, which has often been referred to as the false confession capital of the United States. Juan Rivera was a particularly susceptible target because he had a low IQ and a history of mental illness. He probably also didn't understand his rights, which is why police were able to question him for 4 days in a row without an attorney present. But you'll also find plenty of other cases where innocent people without any mental issues still broke down and confessed after being interrogated for a long period of time because they just wanted the interrogation to stop and decided to tell the police what they wanted to hear. This kind of thing could happen to anybody, and unfortunately, even when they're false, confessions still hold a lot of weight for some people. It obviously held a lot of weight for Juan Rivera, because even after DNA evidence seemed to exonerate him, the jury at his third trial still found him guilty, probably because they thought, well, why did he confess to the crime if he didn't actually do it? But I think we've reached the point where we can close the chapter on Juan Rivera's story. Juan was the victim of a horrible injustice, but he is a free man now, and he received a huge settlement for his ordeal, so I hope he gets to live out the rest of his life in peace. However, the person who still hasn't received justice is Holly Staker, and I want to devote the rest of this podcast to figuring out who actually killed her. Sadly, one thing you'll often find in wrongful conviction stories is that so much attention is put on the person who was unjustly put in prison that the actual victim of the crime is overlooked. And that really should not happen here, because I can't think of another case where a murder victim's reputation was dragged through the mud like this. It's absolutely disgusting that even after DNA evidence excluded Rivera, the state didn't just cut their losses and let him go. Instead, they went to trial again and decided that the best way to secure conviction would be to smear the victim. Seriously, if you are a prosecuting attorney and you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, I am going to send an innocent man to prison, and my case is going to be based around proving that a murdered 11-year-old girl was sexually active, then you really need to find yourself another goddamn profession. Like I said earlier, bringing up a victim's past sexual history is a strategy you'd expect from the defense team in a rape trial, not the prosecution in a murder trial. But believe it or not, this is not even the first time something like this has happened. You will find other examples of wrongful conviction cases where a victim was sexually assaulted and murdered, and DNA testing was performed on a semen sample and excluded the defendant. But instead of conceding that the defendant was innocent, the state would push forward with a theory that the victim had consensual sex with some other person shortly before they were murdered, and this unknown person was the source of the DNA. In legal circles, there's a term used to describe this strategy called the unindicted co-ejaculator. Just to provide another example of this, a 16-year-old kid named Jeffrey Deskovic was wrongly convicted for the 1989 rape and murder of a 15-year-old classmate named Angela Correa, even though DNA testing on semen samples excluded him as the perpetrator. Once again, the state pushed forward the absurd scenario that the victim had consensual sex with an unknown individual shortly before Deskovic murdered her, and because of this, he wound up serving 16 years in prison. Of course, this strategy was particularly egregious in the Holly Staker murder because she was only 11 years old. Even when Rivera was exonerated, prosecuting attorney Mike Mermel still continued to maintain his stance that Holly was sexually active and that the exculpatory DNA evidence did not prove Rivera's innocence. Here is a quote from Mermel where he uses a ridiculous analogy to justify this logic. The example I like to give people is next time you go to a motel room, bring a plastic bag, because the dirtiest thing in that room is the remote control. Everybody has sex and rolls over and goes, I wonder what's on. Okay, so you can find DNA in the form of sperm from 10 different people in that room from that remote control, or even on a person who has touched it. And that woman gets murdered in that room tonight, and you are going to have a lot of DNA. Is it all going to be forensically significant? Yeah. There was such a backlash to Mermel's comments that he was finally pressured into resigning, and I'm happy to know that this man will never ever peddle this garbage in a courtroom again. Another tragic layer to this story is that Holly's twin sister Heather was originally supposed to babysit at the Engelbrecht's apartment on the night of the murder until Holly volunteered to take her place. Heather has gone on to live a pretty rough life, as she's had troubles with the law and drug addiction, and I'm sure the guilt over what happened to her sister may have been a contributing factor. So you can only imagine how difficult it must have been for Heather to be called to the stand at her sister's murder trial to share a story about sexual abuse from their childhood which had no relevance to the case. Now it is worth noting that even after Rivera's release, Holly's family have still continued to believe that he killed her. And under the circumstances, I cannot fault them for this, as I can't imagine how painful the entire ordeal must have been for them. One aspect of wrongful conviction cases which often gets overlooked is the effect they must have on the families of the victims. It must be absolute hell to lose a loved one, and then believe you've attained justice once someone is convicted of the crime, only to be told that the wrong person went to prison and that the real killer might still be out there somewhere. Holly's case is quite an extraordinary situation, because her family had to sit through 3 separate trials and witness the state make unfounded allegations about her sexual activities, but in the end, the man originally convicted of her murder went free, and there's no telling if the real perpetrator will ever be caught. So I really hope that Holly's family does finally receive full closure someday, but that leads us to our next question. If Juan Rivera didn't murder Holly, then who did? the investigation never really uncovered a strong suspect with a motive to kill Holly. According to the original police reports, there were unconfirmed rumors that at least 2 other men had admitted to murdering Holly. One of them apparently said that he stabbed her so many times that he got tired. The crime did not exactly take place in the nicest neighborhood, as at least 3 convicted sex offenders lived in the area at that time, and the apartment was located around the corner from a boarding house filled with transients. However, once Rivera was charged with the crime, none of these leads were pursued. I am on the fence about whether Holly might have been killed by someone she knew, or if she was murdered by a complete stranger. The fact that she was stabbed 27 times suggests that this was a really personal crime. On the other hand, this also could have easily been a crime of opportunity. Shortly after she arrived to babysit, Holly took 2-year-old Taylor to a nearby store to buy some pizza for dinner before they returned to the apartment. It's possible that some stranger in the area might have seen Holly, followed her back to the apartment, and thought she would be an ideal target because she was there alone with a small child and there were no adults around. One detail I've always found curious is that Dawn Engelbrecht claimed that nothing was missing from the apartment except a photograph of her from the mantel. So this would seem to rule out the idea that Holly's murder was the result of a botched burglary, but why did the perpetrator take Dawn's photo? I suppose they might have wanted to keep a memento of the crime or something, but that seems pretty odd considering that Holly didn't live there and Dawn wasn't part of her family. Could the killer actually have had some sort of grudge against Dawn Engelbrecht and her family, and Holly just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Anything is possible, I guess. Of course, the real wild card in this case is the DNA evidence found on the 2x4 used to beat Delwyn Foxworth 7.5 years later. This is yet another frustrating aspect of wrongful conviction stories which gets overlooked. When the authorities get so focused on convicting an innocent person that the real killer is ignored, and this gives them the opportunity to harm other people. Here's a particularly scandalous wrongful conviction case which also took place in Illinois, and has a lot of similarities to this one. In 1983, a 10-year-old girl named Janine Nicarico was murdered, and 2 suspects, Rolando Cruz and Alejandro Hernandez, were convicted and sentenced to death for the crime. Even though there was plenty of exculpatory evidence to support their innocence, the state orchestrated a major cover-up, and it would be over a decade before the 2 defendants were exonerated. The state was so focused on railroading 2 innocent men that Janine Nicarico's real killer, Brian Dugan, remained free for the next 2 years and murdered 2 other victims, one of whom was a 7-year-old girl. And it appears that's exactly what happened here. Since Juan Rivera was serving time in prison for his crime, Holly Staker's killer remained free and wound up participating in the brutal murder of Delwyn Foxworth. And incredibly, it's possible that yet another innocent person, Marvin Tyrone Williford, is currently in prison for that crime. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of detailed information out there about this particular case. All I know is that Foxworth allegedly owed a debt to Williford, and that the only serious evidence against him is the eyewitness testimony of Foxworth's girlfriend, who identified Williford as one of the perpetrators. Since DNA evidence from the Foxworth murder matches DNA from the Holly Staker murder, but does not match Williford, his attorneys believe this proves his innocence. However, overturning Williford's conviction sounds like it might be an uphill battle. Yes, the DNA evidence proves that Williford did not murder Holly Staker and that his blood is not on the 2x4, but the state's argument is that this does not prove Williford wasn't involved in Foxworth's murder. And from a technical standpoint, they are correct, as there were 3 perpetrators who committed this crime, so even though Williford's DNA does not match the blood evidence, this does not necessarily mean he wasn't there. In Williford's defense, there is no physical evidence placing him at the murder scene, so he very well could be innocent, but it's really hard to make a definitive conclusion. However, even if Williford is guilty, there are still 2 other suspects who participated in the Foxworth murder that have never been charged. I hope that investigators are still actively looking for them, though I wouldn't hold my breath. But if Williford was actually guilty of this crime, then this could potentially provide the best opportunity to solve Holly Staker's murder. Williford is currently serving an 80-year sentence, so if I were in power, and I wanted to get both these cases solved, I might try offering him a deal. reduce Williford's sentence in exchange for giving up his two accomplices in the Foxworth murder. If the DNA of either of these accomplices matches the blood found on the 2x4, then that means they also killed Holly Staker. Of course, that case has been such a huge source of controversy these past 2 decades that I'm not sure anyone in power right now wants to open up that can of worms. And if Williford really is innocent and wasn't involved in the Foxworth murder, then offering him a deal to give up his accomplices obviously isn't going to do much good. But Delwyn Foxworth's death is a pretty harrowing reminder of what a sick person Holly Staker's murderer must be. After sexually assaulting an 11-year-old girl and stabbing her 27 times, this man then went on to beat a man with a 2x4 before pouring gasoline on him and burning him alive. Who knows how many other people they may have harmed? If Marvin Tyrone Williford had no involvement in this crime, then some unknown psycho has committed not one, but 2 murders in which a completely innocent person has gone to prison for their crimes. If that's not a searing indictment of the justice system, then I don't know what is. So we have now reached the end of one of the most outrageous wrongful conviction stories you will ever hear, but remember, the story has not yet reached its resolution, and there's a murdered 11-year-old girl who still needs justice. So if you have any information about the murder of Holly Staker, or if you know the identities of the other 2 men who were involved in the murder of Delwyn Foxworth, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own personal theory about what happened in either of these cases, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to send out a big thank you to all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. A big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and of course a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes our eerie music score. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website. So if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all of the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next time for a brand new minisode of The Trail Went Cold.